John O'Nolan, welcome to the WP Minute.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Founder and CEO at Ghost. We're going to dive right into it. There's lots of stuff happening, of course, in the WordPress world, but I'm going to put you on the hot seat. I literally just told John in the green room I wasn't going to put him on the hot seat, but we're going to put him on the hot seat. About Ghost. You're the founder, of course, Ghost. You created Ghost. I hate to say it, I was a customer of Ghost. I'm kind of backtracking my choices as of late, but a fantastic publishing platform. When I went from WordPress to Ghost to run a particular newsletter that I have called The Podcast Setup, I was like, man, this is great. And the one thing that pulled me back into WordPress, which is ironic to say, was Gravity Forms. I'm now an employee, full disclosure, I'm an employee at Gravity Forms, but at the time I wasn't. And I was like, I just need some automation form features from Gravity Forms. And I just need, when people sign up to do an interview, I need it to do things on the site. And that's what brought me back to WordPress. But I had a fantastic time using Ghost. I thought it was great. Promise not, this is not just a full-on ad for Ghost. But how do you wrestle with looking at WordPress and the ecosystem that it has developed? This is a big question. The ecosystem that it has developed with third-party add-ons like Gravity Forms, like the theme ecosystem, like so many other integrations. How do you wrestle with that as an open source CMS founder?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for the kind words. I was sure that the one thing that pulled you back was going to be custom fields, but here we are, forms. Yeah, the blessing and the curse of WordPress in my mind has always been the power and the extensibility of the platform and its ecosystem and all the different things you can do with it. On the one hand, amazing. On the other hand, comes with some downsides, comes with complexity of integration, comes with security issues, sometimes update servers that you may or may not have access to, all those things. And I think different platforms have different answers should have different answers depending on what they're trying to do. WordPress is what I would call a generalized CMS. You can kind of decide what you want to build with it, and it can become that. It can morph into an e-commerce platform or a real estate directory listing or a blog or a business website. And the extensibility allows you to fulfill those different use cases. So it's absolutely critical that you kind of have this really deep set of capabilities that plugins can hook into. What we do with Ghost is in many ways kind of the opposite. We've focused in on a single set of use cases, which is publishing, and publishing professionally, effectively. And so we try and take all of the things for those sets of workflows and just build them natively into core. So the way we kind of think about extensibility is it's just quite different. If there's something that everyone's asking for, it kind of should be in core. And if there's a longer tail set of things people are trying to do, then usually we try and do that via an integration with a product that lives outside of core, usually via API. Or in some cases, it's just really indicative that you're trying to do something that the product wasn't designed for, and there might be better capability or better other options out there that have the capabilities you need.
Yeah. Lots of folks, of course, now evaluating their WordPress futures, and lots of developers and designers who might be looking at other platforms. What is the best way that you would want this kind of talent to onboard into the Ghost ecosystem? In WordPress land, we have the Make blogs, we have the Slack if you're not banned, we have these developer guidelines that help encourage you how to build blocks and plugins. Is that same kind of educational and onboarding structure available for folks coming from the WordPress world, or like, hey, I'm looking for new opportunity, how can I do it here?
Yeah, it is. It's not nearly as extensive. The scale of the WordPress ecosystem means you can find almost anything on any topic, tutorial, guide, video, podcast, or whatever you can think of. We don't have quite the breadth of content, but we do have pretty reasonable depth. So if you have never heard of Ghost before, or you have, but you haven't tried it, our website's a good place to start. We have documentation, we have tutorials, we have examples. Probably the best way to try it out is simply to kick the tires. You can sign up on ghost.org for a free trial, no obligation. We will not be automatically charged at the end of it, and have a fully managed instance spun up, working, and get a sense of how things work. Have a look at the theme layer, have a look at the integrations layer. Ghost theme layer is modeled after WordPress. So if you are a WordPress theme developer, familiar with, all of the hooks and functions and data outputs that you would normally use there, it's going to feel fairly familiar. There's a couple of concepts which are different, but the syntax is not a million miles away from what you're most likely already used to.
Now I'm not a developer, but is the stack traditional HTML, CSS, PHP with a dash of JavaScript? Is it heavy JavaScript like WordPress is moving to? What should one know for coding languages getting into this?
It's heavy JavaScript, but for most people, you would never have to touch that. So the back end of Ghost is written in Node.js, and the front end uses a templating language called Handlebars.js. Handlebars.js ostensibly looks a lot like the kind of PHP functions you would use in a WordPress theme layer. So if you're comfortable as a theme developer in WordPress, you would have a very easy time adapting to the theme layer in Ghost. It's all familiar concepts. If you wanted to do integrations or kind of more powerful things with Ghost, then you're kind of looking at interacting with an API, and you do that with whatever you're most comfortable with. That could be PHP, it could be JavaScript, anything you like. But most people don't need to know what Node.js is unless they're trying to self-host, and then you kind of have to run it and install things. But for most developers, pretty straightforward.
That Ghost is a very opinionated, well, these are my words, you could refine it, but you're alluding to the fact that Ghost is very opinionated on the feature set that it has. When I was using it, I was like, yeah, man, this is exactly what I need, until I needed those integrations and that automation that Gravity Forms has. But aside from that, I was like, writing newsletters and blog posts combined, fantastic. Showing me the data and the information that is important to that business, which was email subscribers, revenue. I had a small donation/sponsorship thing going on with that. And it was clean. There was nothing distracting me from the work I needed to get done when I logged into my Ghost site versus my WordPress site, where I'm like, oh, damn, there's another banner that's popping up. There's an update notification yelling at me like, oh, didn't I just update all these plugins, right? And I've been doing this now for nearly 20 years. Like, I should be used to it by now, but it was still sort of like this drain on my energy every time I log in. And that was fantastic. So how do you balance, this is a tough one. How do you balance what customers want and what, let's say, the Ghost community wants? And can you address what the Ghost community looks like? Because we say WordPress community, it means a lot to us in the WordPress world. It means developers, designers giving back to this ecosystem, helping people. And a lot of us, the reason why we're struggling with this recent incident is that we all felt like we've been building WordPress now for nearly 20 years. And we always felt like we had a say in the direction. There's what the customers wanted, and there's what we wanted or want. And that's a tough line to balance. So how do you approach like what your end users want and what the community wants? And what does that look like from your perspective?
It's a great question, and I'm very familiar with the nuances and the challenges of the WordPress community. I was on the WordPress core team, about 14 years ago now. So I was a pretty active contributor, spoke at a lot of WordCamps, did a lot of Make blog posts. There's a lot of history there. And I think it's always a balancing act. We try to approach it as much as possible by listening. I think the job of the core team, as we see it, is to listen to as many inputs as possible and then make good decisions about which requests and things to follow and which to discard. And sometimes that looks like features which are the most aligned with the product and the core audience, the core target users that we're trying to attract. Sometimes it's the things we're most excited about, but all of the time it's trying to make sure that the platform stays true to what it says it is. That is something that has always been kind of deeply important to me. And so it's really a mix of inputs. There's not like a clean answer, but it always starts with listening to what people are saying and taking into account all the different perspectives, all the different ways in which people are using it.
For many years, I think the guiding light's not the right phrase. North Star maybe, and even that's too nice, but there was always this feeling of WordPress must dominate the web, right? So back in your time, it was probably 10, 15, 20% of the internet. Now, look at some different numbers where between 40 and 48% of the modern web, whatever that number is. There was always like this momentum to dominate. What is it mean to you and Ghost? Like, what's your position on like impacting the web, impacting the open web? What are your thoughts on, of course, like the pie of the internet? How much of the slice are you trying to get?
I think DHH's post this week was fairly good on this topic, where he said, the scale of value that Rails has created vastly outstrips that which he has personally captured, and that's a good thing. That's what open source should be about. I agree with that. I would almost take it even further and say that we are attempting to capture the smallest possible slice of the market to sustain our operations and nothing else. So Ghost is a not-for-profit organization, single nonprofit foundation. There's no other companies, with venture funding or other motivations. It's just one nonprofit foundation. And our goal, we have lots of goals, but one of them is to never grow to more than 50 people in headcount. Around 50 people. Might not be exactly that number, but around that mark. And the point in my eyes, or how I think about the future, is not to try and grow the biggest company possible or to try and capture as much value of the web as possible, and certainly not to try and capture a percentage of the web's total market share, but to grow an ecosystem which a core team in the structure of a nonprofit foundation is able to support. And in my mind, that looks like lots of different companies doing well, not one giant company, making the majority of the money and controlling how everything works, but really more of a chaotic, in some ways chaotic, decentralized ecosystem. I think of it as, like a city. You might have lots of shops, lots of houses, lots of different businesses. The goal of leading a good city is to create infrastructure that can allow a diverse set of people to thrive within it, not to control everything and to own everything and to buy up everything and to turn it into some dystopian nightmare. So we're trying to really do the biggest possible thing with the smallest possible team and make enough revenue to make what we do possible, but not more than that in business terms. And usually when I say this, people get very confused. Why not? Why don't you want more? And the answer to that, has been underscored quite a lot in the last few weeks, is the web, not exclusive to WordPress. The web has been driven by a lot of greed and a lot of very wealthy people. And I don't think that we've had the best that we can have from the web and from humanity more broadly, from having power be concentrated in single platforms or single individuals. I think a long tail of small businesses, small platforms, small websites, that's what I want to see more of. And so in many ways, with Ghost, we're trying to make more of what we want to see more of.
Is the number 50 a way to sort of, what I'll say is sort of stopgap that like corporate sort of scale where things can become unruly and out of control? But let me backtrack. First question is, how many people are you at now? Goal's 50. Where are you at now?
We're mid-30s now.
Mid-30s. So is that number to stopgap what could happen beyond 50? Because I know I've been labeled a bit of a mad apologist, only because I'm trying to deconstruct what is happening. But at the same time, like, I could not imagine running a 1,700 person organization like that with the deep level of control that he still runs it with. How could you? How could you do that? I can understand that task alone is stressful and could lead to some real wacky decisions, outbursts, and comments. Is that 50 to stopgap that growth and that unruliness that could happen in an organization?
Yes and no. It's definitely not easy to run a company of any size, and it definitely doesn't get easier as you get bigger. That being said, there's quite a lot of people who are doing it very well for every person who's perhaps not doing such a good job of it. And it's not something we have no reference material for, right? 1,700 people dwarfs in comparison to the 19,000 at NVIDIA or the hundreds of thousands at Microsoft. There are playbooks, there are good advice out there. There's a lot of hard problems you have to solve along the way, but there are also a lot of easy things that you can not step in along the way. And I think the things we've seen within the WordPress community in the last 3 weeks have not been representative of the hard problems of running a 1,700 person company. They have been some of the 101 basics of things you don't do, whether you are a freelancer, a one person company, or a two person company. And that's the thing that I've found a bit disappointing. But the stopgap that you were kind of alluring to in our context is less about, I think companies by definition, get unruly at scale. And that's something I'm worried about. It's more, it doesn't seem like fun to me. My idea of a good time is not having 8 layers of management and not knowing anyone's name. My idea of fun is honestly harkens back to my WordPress contribution days, where I would show up on IRC, I would chat shit with a bunch of the other contributors, and we would make cool stuff together. And at the end of the day or the month or whatever it was, we would release stuff that I, sitting on a laptop in a pair of $2 shorts on a beach in the Philippines, had written with no status, no money, no clout, and it would get released to hundreds of millions of people. That's my idea of a good time. Having a tight-knit team of people doing really cool stuff at a scale that doesn't make sense just because of the amazingness of open source and how far and wide it goes. So I simply don't want to run a company more than 50 people, because I think that's the point at which you start to lose that. And we have a lot of team members who come from startups that grew past that point, and they all kind of have the same story, which is like, it was great at the beginning, it was really fun, we were doing all this cool stuff. And then around 60, 70, 100 people, it started to break down. New layers of management were required, the priorities changed, it didn't feel the same anymore. It just doesn't sound like fun to me. So there's a selfish goal in there of, with Ghost being a nonprofit, I don't stand to sell it one day or make a shitload of money off it. So it has to be something I enjoy. It has to be something that I'm fully invested in, that feels like something I could do for a long time. Because if it's just a slog for the sake of scale, there's nothing to it. So keeping it small, keeping it focused is a creative constraint we've chosen. And what's fun about choosing constraints is invariably you have to try and get around them, right? You've got this constraint. What are we going to do with it? We've only got 50 people. Well, that changes what's possible with the product. It changes with what's possible with what portion of the market you serve, what type of market that is. It changes all kinds of things that then there's an amazing amount of creativity that comes from those and trying to figure them out. So I'm a huge fan of creative constraints of any kind, and this is just one of ours.
Yeah. Can you explain or illustrate how your nonprofit compares to, let's say, this tangled web of the WordPress Foundation and WordPress.org and WordPress.com and Automatic? Like, we all thought we kind of knew how it worked, and I think many of us knew like 85% of it over the last few years. And this whole situation kind of like brought to light like this 15% that was like, where did that come from? How does your nonprofit work? What happens what's the bus factor for John O'Nolan? If there's no John O'Nolan, what happens to Ghost and the nonprofit side of the house? Illustrate how that works, as a lot of us are kind of worried about our own plumbing in WordPress.
Definitely. A lot of the way we've structured things was inadvertently inspired by Automatic and WP Engine, believe it or not, 12 years ago. So being in the WordPress kind of core team and seeing how the product was made, I had direct exposure to kind of all of these issues, perhaps earlier than other people. And the tension and the kind of conflicting motivations and priorities of all these different organizations within WordPress, I always found difficult. You cannot have a venture-backed arm on the one hand, a nonprofit foundation on the other, and a .org website on the third, all controlled by the same person, even though they have conflicting priorities, and expect everything to be smooth sailing. It was always going to be a matter of when, not if, this happened. The amusing thing is that all these conflicts were what inspired a lot of ideas for Ghost of how not to do that. I was very bought into the idea of democratizing publishing when I was working on WordPress, and that still means a lot to me. And the conflicts of interest around kind of all the positioning that goes on behind the scenes was not what I was excited about at all. So a lot of the ideas for Ghost were based on what would an open source product that's trying to just democratize publishing look like if it lived up to its ideals. Now, I don't know if we've succeeded in that, but the angle we came up with was an attempt at trying to answer that question. So Ghost is a single nonprofit foundation, and that nonprofit foundation sells a managed hosting service, which we modeled after WP Engine. It seemed like WP Engine had a great business model. You had the full power of WordPress, but you didn't have to worry about servers. Whereas by comparison, as you'll remember, WordPress.com was not used by anyone who knew anything about WordPress. These days, you can do themes and plugins, but for a very long time, you had no option to run themes or plugins. So in my mind, I wanted to have the simplicity of a nonprofit organization to steward the open source project, the business model of WP Engine to fund that open source project, and the transparency and integrity of what an open source project should be, which is to have no outside influences or ulterior motives that come, whether you want them or not, the second you take venture capital. And so far, so good. We're 12 years in now. We are at $7.5 million a year in revenue, and we were profitable from the very first year. There were enough people that kind of believed in that model, although there were many more who didn't quite understand what was the point. Why do you need this weird nonprofit model? And if anything, I think the last few weeks have drawn attention to why it can be a good idea.
Is there a board of directors on the foundation, or how does that sort of oversight work in Ghost?
Yeah, you're right. I skipped the bus factor. That was part of your question. So in a non-profit foundation, you have a board of trustees. And at the moment, those two trustees are myself, my co-founder, Hannah. And for the first 10 years up until now of Ghost, I think that's been roughly the right model. Getting something going, getting off the ground, you really don't need decision by consensus or much oversight. You just need to prove that there's a market for the thing you're doing, and that requires simply moving quickly. One of the things I see often is, people coming out with a big manifesto and a big governance structure before they've built a product, which is the wrong way around of doing things, because people aren't buying your governance structure, they're buying your product. But why people stick around often when something gets popular or large is if it does have a good governance structure, which allows it to persist without inadvertently decimating itself at some point. And so as Ghost gets bigger, my intention, and I'm going to write a bit more about this soon, is to have the board of trustees grow, to have independently appointed people that we have selected, but also to have board seats that are elected by the community. And I think it's going to be interesting figuring out what are the different constituencies within that community, how long should a board seat work. But equally, there's some great reference material out there. Rails has a foundation that seems to work pretty well. Drupal has a foundation with elected board seats that seems to work pretty well. There are all kinds of organizations outside of software development and direct open source that have collaborative board seats that oversee the larger direction of a nonprofit foundation. And that's exactly where I want us to end up. The bus factor of me should eventually be 0. I do not want to be a benevolent dictator for life. Honestly, I think BDFL stuff is the dumbest idea alive. It was coined, I don't know if you know this already, you probably do. It was coined by the creator of Python, who said it as a throwaway line, as a joke, that he was a benevolent dictator for life, not as a serious thing. And then for some reason, a whole bunch of people latched onto it. And what bothers me about benevolent dictator for life is that the word benevolent is doing way too much work in that sentence. If you just said dictator for life in any other context, we would universally agree that that's a bad idea. And when you have a mission of democratizing publishing, it just doesn't feel like it makes sense. So no, my intent, I currently have a bus factor of 50% of the foundation. I would like to reduce that to 0. I plan to not be in charge of Ghost for life. I plan to very much not be even in control of Ghost for life. I don't, at the very least, I don't own any of the assets. I don't own anything to do with it personally. Every single thing is owned by the foundation. So in that sense, the bus factor is already reduced. The domain, the trademarks, all those things, those are already not mine. I have no financial or legal claim to them.
In in some of the edge cases of amazing product companies, and I'm not trying to align, Mullenweg with Steve Jobs by any stretch of the imagination, but we've seen amazing product companies led by one decision maker, right? Maybe it is the BDFL for life in some instances, like an Apple, like a Microsoft, where like Elon with let's say either a Tesla or SpaceX. Like pick your poison on that one. I feel like there always needs to be like this grand visionary and one person who is leading that real cutting edge decision making in an organization. In the WordPress world, it's always felt like, well, we all have some choice, right? Don't we? Don't we have some choice in this direction? And it's seemingly getting more obvious that, all roads lead back to Matt, right? Mm-hmm. And that decision making. How do you balance your grand vision for the platform, for your platform, Ghost, and how are decisions made in your world? Are you the leading decision maker, innovator, and like you're setting the 5 to 10 year roadmap, and sure, people can have their sort of say in it, but largely you're 95% of the visionary behind Ghost?
I think one of the cultural moments that we're in at the moment is celebrating founders and visionaries, people doing things in business to an almost insane degree, to the point where they, cult leader, founder, it's not that different. And we've probably gone a little bit too far on that. I do think it is very helpful for getting new ideas started, new products made, to have someone who is deranged enough to believe they can change the world, or whatever the correct version of that quote is. And I do think great products, by and large, are made by individuals, certainly not by committees. I also think that the staying power of a company or an organization has to, at some point, transcend one individual. And, to pick up on a couple of the examples you mentioned there, Apple continued to thrive after Steve Jobs. Now, we can argue about whether or not they still make good products and whether there's the right person calling product shots there. And I would tend to say the answer to that is no. But the organization has outlasted because it was able to transcend. It was able to evolve after the founder was no longer around. Microsoft's another great example because we have 3 axes to it. You have Bill Gates, who got it going, had the big vision. You have Steve Ballmer, who by all accounts made Microsoft flounder, but had the organization become very profitable, which is kind of what Tim Cook's doing now. And now we have Satya Nadella, who's come in, and okay, we now have big visionary ideas coming out of Microsoft. We have for a few years now. Microsoft is doing some of the most impressive hardware, software, investment, and acquisitions of any large tech company. And it is a visionary individual with big ideas making decisions, but it's not the founder. So to the extent that I think you need one person making big shots in order to do big things, I think that's true. I think I agree with that. Does it have to be one person for life or the original founder of the company? I don't think so. In the context of Ghosts, that's currently me. Yes, I am that person. I make those decisions. I think I do an okay job, although some would look at the size of Ghosts as compared to WordPress and say I've not done a good job, and that's okay. But I don't intend for it to be me forever. I also don't intend for it to someday be a committee. I think you need one leader with clear ideas. I think the key difference that I really hope WordPress ends up at, and certainly where I want us to end up at, is if you're going to democratize publishing, then that person should be democratically elected somehow. There should be some ability for the broader community to decide who that leader is and then trust them to make good decisions and vote whether or not they are. Without that, it is just a dictatorship. Not a dictatorship in the sexy, good way, if there is one of those, just a textbook dictatorship. And history shows that they usually all end the same way.
Sustainability. One of the things that has come up with this whole WordPress versus WP Engine thing, some folks are like, oh, I didn't know you needed the money, Matt and co. Why have you not just asked, right? Why have you not just asked for donations? I'm on the ghost.org/pricing page, just looking at the pricing plans as a backdrop to revenue and funding and stuff like this. It starts at $11 a month for 500 of your own subscribers to your email list, or members as you call them. 11, 31, 63, 249. This is monthly pricing, and then there's yearly discount. Folks might say, well, if there's never a chance for outside funding, or maybe there is, I don't know, I'll let you highlight that. Why not ask for a donation hey, Ghost is open source. We also need to survive, and maybe hosting isn't going to carry us all the way. What are your thoughts on like that long-term sustainability that goes outside of the pricing page?
Yeah, it's kind of easy. By having these things live in one organization, we have the simplest thing in the world. We can say, if you want to contribute to Ghost, you feel aligned with the project, you would like it to succeed, use our hosting. Our hosting pays for the open source developers who work on the core products and improve it for you. So by simply using Ghost, you are contributing to Ghost. If you never write a single pull request, but you use our hosting, you're directly funding the nonprofit foundation that makes this possible. And that's not a coincidence. The idea of this business model was exactly that, was to make it so that the users of the product are the people who are investing in the future of the product. We have tried having like a donation button or mentioning it on the site. I think we found much the same thing as the WordPress Foundation has found, which is you don't get very many donations. People, for the most part, don't donate to things like tech companies and tech products. It just doesn't, that's not a thing that happens. And I had in my head that when Go started, I was like, oh, maybe, Google will give us a bunch of money like they give Mozilla. These grand ideas of philanthropy, that hasn't panned out either. So making the hosting model work, making sure that we have enough margins to run the business has been super important, but it also hasn't been very complicated. I think when I think about what could be other ways that we would make the organization more financially successful or to kind of have other revenue streams, there's a lot of options, but they all kind of hinge on incentives. Something that I think has been missing in the WordPress space is, why should anyone contribute 5% back? What are they getting in return? Because if it's just a kind of give me 5% or I'll go nuclear, it's just not a very good incentive. But there's lots of other projects that have done this better, and we're not one of them because we haven't tried this yet. But if you look at Laravel, they have a sponsors section, and for I think it's thousands of dollars per month, you can sponsor the Laravel community, the open source project, and you will get a prominent partners page on the website, listed as an official partner, recognizing what you do, marketing your services if required. So it seems like the price point would be pretty high if WordPress did something similar. It seems like if there was something you got in return for financially contributing to the WordPress project, then you're selling a product. But if you're just saying, give us money and we're not giving you anything back, yeah, that's a harder sell. It's a harder sell for really anyone, but particularly for a software product that you can't see. You have to come up with something, I think.
That spurred something that is highly debated in the WordPress space, is where do you draw the line between contributions to WordPress and just like profiting off a product? And just to frame that, there's just a lot of people who have plugins and themes and services that they sell, and they say, well, the byproduct of me selling this product means that people are interested in sticking around WordPress. Let's call it a page builder, for instance. You might say, I built this page builder. It's actually helping people use WordPress. I'm getting paid, let's say $200 a year for it. Therefore, I'm contributing to WordPress. Where do you stand on that? I see that. I'll frame it and I'll give you a second to think about it. I think of it as, well, you're contributing to, let's say, the greater ecosystem of WordPress, right? Users and other businesses kind of benefit from you building this product, but you're not contributing to open source WordPress. Like, you're not contributing to the core of WordPress, which impacts all millions of people who use WordPress. You're contributing to the ecosystem, which helps maybe, let's say, 100,000 people in the ecosystem use WordPress better. That's the way I see it. Where do you draw the line between I'm contributing by making a product, or I'm contributing by committing lines of open source code?
Yeah, I think the litmus test that I would use, and I'm not suggesting everyone should use this, is would WordPress exist today or be as large as it is today if you took away all of the non-official themes and plugins? If those just went away and the only themes and plugins available were automatics, would WordPress be around? Would it be as large? If the answer to that is no, and I think it's up to everyone to hypothesize for themselves, if the answer to that is no, then it follows that the people who have created those themes and plugins have been in part responsible for the growth and the success of WordPress. And if that's true, then they have contributed. In my mind, they've contributed a lot, regardless of whether or not they make money from the things they've worked on. You should be allowed to make a business. That no one should forbid you from doing that. So those contributions, I think, are completely valid, and it's not an impossible thing to measure. It's a hard thing to measure, but again, Drupal does this pretty well. They have a really clear framework for how contributions are measured and what things are included. It's self-reported, but there's oversight. There's a clear decision-making framework around what things are and are not recognized. And they've created incentives around what it means to be a contributor and how you're recognized as, being a maker or a taker, as Dries put it. So there's ways to do it, but I think every participant in an ecosystem is contributing to that ecosystem. Is there another definition of contribution, which is purely about core and evolving the core platform? Sure. But you know what? I'm not sure if that should be entirely volunteer based all the time. I remember when I was never paid to contribute to WordPress, and I remember it was almost a dirty word to consider, like being paid to contribute to open source, almost like it should be purely altruistic and we should all just collaborate because then the thing gets better and we all benefit from it. And that's a lovely idea, but in the meantime, the rest of the web is moving forward without us. And as Morten has pointed out on more than one occasion, there's a lot of people contributing meaningfully to WordPress who are struggling to put food on their table. And the idea of bug bounties or paying open source contributors is kind of, no, we can't talk about that. But this should be everyone volunteering and working together. And I think maybe, this is just maybe a controversial opinion, I think maybe we're at the end of the road for that ideology of open source. I think maybe open source projects need to generate revenue and they need to pay their contributors. And in doing so, create an incentive for people to contribute. I don't know what that looks like. I don't even know if that's right, but that's kind of where I'm leaning after, 2 decades of doing this.
John O'Nolan, it's ghost.org, independent technology for modern publishing. I might come back. All right, listen, I might come back to Ghost. WordPress is as much criticism as Gutenberg gets from like a page builder perspective. Writing in WordPress, publishing posts in WordPress is a pretty good experience. And Gutenberg does elevate that, in my opinion, and Ghost is right there with it. I've been doing a video where I'm evaluating other platforms for just the writing experience. Ghost is fantastic. When I first started writing on it, I was like, this is great. Plenty of integrations. Check it out. Don't just listen to me about my bias to Gravity Forms. There are a ton of integrations there in the platform. And again, if you're doing a newsletter, and especially monetizing a newsletter, the dashboard, the data that it surfaces for your publishing business is great. But I am plagued, I've been addicted to the power user, like page building experience in WordPress. And that's the part that is also like tying me to WordPress. Like, I just need to, can I add another column here? Can I make category pages? Can I do this in a browser? Because I don't know a lick of code for any of this stuff. It's a powerful drug and it does have me hooked, but Ghost is fantastic. And check out the themes that are available because maybe it'll make your life easier. It does. It did for me. And then, I got hooked on that automations thing that I needed. Ghost.org. Check it out. John, fantastic conversation. Thanks for hanging out today.
Thank you for having me. There's a lot of great platforms out there, and you don't have to pick just one. Just because you use one doesn't mean you have to be against the other. I'll just leave you with that parting thought. Use different tools for different jobs and enjoy them all and compare and contrast them, get inspiration from them. One of the great initiatives Drupal had, I feel like I've mentioned Drupal last day, was getting off the island. And I think it was in 2012, Dries encouraged everyone to simply go out into the world and look at other open source projects, look at other products, see what you could learn from them. And so, I don't want anyone to come and use Ghost and leave WordPress, but I would love everyone who uses WordPress to try Ghost and see what they think and tell us where we could improve. It's a good thing that we have a diversity of platforms. It should not be a large proportion of the web all on the exact same thing. Let's have lots of different options. Custom fields coming to Ghost soon? I tweeted that kind of as a joke from the WordPress account. I mean, from from the core Ghost account, and the response was pretty overwhelming. So let's see if we can do anything there. Look to ghost.org for custom post types and custom fields coming soon. All right, everybody, thanks for listening to today's episode. The WPminute.com, the WPminute.com/subscribe to stay connected. We'll see you in the next episode.